Hello, my name is Rory, and welcome back to the Sailing Technical Channel, where we explore the engineering behind sailing. This will be the final episode in the series on heavy weather. In episode 1, we examined the relationship between wind speed and forces on your sails and rudder control when running downwind. In episode 2, we explored vortices, an often misunderstood phenomenon responsible for countless capsizes and broaches. In episode 3, we learned that wind strength, duration, and fetch determine wave height and wavelength, and we examined human tolerance to rolling and vertical accelerations. In episode 4, we looked at wave interference and rotary flows that occur in wave crests and troughs, and these little-known motions have a significant effect on rudder authority and steering control. In episode 5, we saw how waves become unstable after they reach a height ratio of 1 to 7, and they convert potential energy into kinetic with breakers that wreak havoc and kill sailors. In episode 6, we reviewed Professor Marhi's conclusions following the Fasten inquiry, including why heavier, full-kill yachts are often considered more sea-kindly in heavy weather. Now, with regards to this final episode 7, I've elected not to include an episode on D-Day, as it is essentially off-topic, and most viewer interest is related to sailing your own boats. Now, some of my most rewarding experiences have been sailing in strong winds and large seas. So in this episode, we will review some excellent trading videos for the laser ILCAs that demonstrate heavy weather sailing techniques, both upwind and downwind, and then examine the aerodynamic and hydrodynamic reason why those techniques work. So if you're new to this channel and you're a sailor that want to fully understand how you can sail faster in higher winds and waves, please press like and subscribe. Also, to get the most out of this episode, you should go back and watch episodes number 1 and 4, as they really are prerequisites. Finally, in the outro, I will be asking subscribers whether they'd like me to continue producing this type of engineering-based explanations of sailing performance and boat handling. So if you're interested in sailing faster, please stay with me till the end, and with that, let's get started. Slide 2. More thoughts on rudder stalls and rotary flow. Before proceeding with dinghies, however, I want to respond to some viewer comments. One of my subscribers noticed that he felt a sluggishness in the rudder when the stern was on a wave crest, but never quite understood why until seeing the explanation in episode 4. And as we now know, it is related to the rotary flow shown on the upper right diagram. You may recall from episode 1, I suggested it might be useful to mark the maximum effective rudder angle, slightly less than the stall angle of about 21 degrees. This would help prevent the rudder from being turned beyond the point where the additional helm produces no additional turning force. Now, let's return to the far 40 helmsman shown on the upper left diagram. Although the helm appears to be hard over to starboard, the rudder has likely stalled, and once past the critical stall angle of attack, increasing the rudder angle only increases the drag and does little to improve steering control. Another subscriber, who sails a laser, ILCA, asked whether marking the stall angle would be useful on a dinghy. Given how rapidly advanced developed in small boats, I had to concede the idea was probably impractical. Now, we saw the lower diagrams as keels in episode 6 in Marhi's explanation on roll dampening. But as they are symmetrical foils, let us now consider them as rudders, as these diagrams illustrate what happens hydrodynamically. The black arrow represents the total rudder hydrodynamic force. The green arrow represents the lift component, acting at right angles to the water flow. And the purple arrow represents the drag component, acting parallel with the water flow. The sketch on the left shows the forces generated by a normally operating rudder with attached flow as it would cycle through the varying angles of attack. The sketch on the right, however, shows a stalled rudder with the flow approaching beyond its stall angle. Notice that the total force shown by the black arrow changes only modestly, but lift decreases significantly while drag increases substantially. This suggests that a helmsman may not feel a dramatic change in helm load when the stall occurs, even though the rudder effectiveness has been severely reduced. When running in waves, the situation becomes even more complex. The helmsman is unlikely to have the situational awareness to know whether the rudder is operating regarding the orbital flow direction. In other words, whether the rudder is on or near a crest that would give reduced rudder authority, or in the counterflow near or in a trough that increases rudder authority. The takeaway from this slide is twofold. First, rudder stall is most likely to occur when the rudder authority has been reduced by the surrounding orbital flow on a crest. Second, by limiting rudder angle to slightly less than the stall angle, while the rudder is on a crest, a helmsman may retain just enough rudder effectiveness to prevent a developing yaw until the boat moves into a trough with a counterflow, whereby increased rudder authority can once again restore control. In summary, if you steer with a tiller, you can develop a sense of muscle memory. Think of 22.5 degrees as half of the maximum of the 45-degree tiller movement typically used on a run. By keeping the tiller about 5 degrees short of the maximum position, you are more likely to stay within the rudder's effective working angle, reducing the risk of rudder stall, excessive yaw, and rounding up on a jibe broach. Then with that, next slide, please. Slide 3, Sailing Upwind Through Waves. Let's begin with sailing upwind in waves and hear the advice of sailing coach Dan Self. Pay close attention to his recommendations. They are some of the most effective ways to improve your VMG to windward. Let's play the video from the beginning.
Sailing upwind through waves requires a careful combination of steering, sheeting, and body weight movements. The goal when sailing through waves is to keep your bow fully in the water and avoid any slapping of your bow and avoid being slowed down by the waves. Basic principle of steering through waves is to sail directly up the face of the wave and at an angle down the back of the wave to keep your bow connected to the water. In most conditions, this will mean steering to windward when going up the wave and bearing away down the back of the wave. Here you can see both sailors steering the boat into the wind going up the wave, then quickly bearing away after the peak. Steering through waves can significantly change your apparent wind and requires you to sheet your sail frequently as you pass over the wave. The biggest shift in apparent wind happens at the top of the wave, where you will bear away and your apparent wind will increase. When you hit the top of the wave, your aim is to quickly release enough sheet to A, keep the boat flat, and B, allow you to bear away on the back of the wave. To maximize your VMG in waves, your best opportunities to gain height are going up the face of the waves. This means sheeting in as much as possible while going up the wave and steering to windward before releasing the sheet at the top of the wave. This is very physically demanding, and the constant sheeting in waves is what separates some of the best sailors from the middle of the fleet.
Slide 4, Upwind Sail Forces in Flat Water. Let's try to understand why he gives the advice for sailing upwind in waves. But first, we need to understand the forces a sail generates in flat water. In episode 1, we learned about the lift and drag curve for rudder, which is a symmetrical foil. You may recall in the Rudder Stall video, the narrator frequently referred to the lift to drag ratio. Let us now examine a similar concept for a sail. The diagram on the left is a measured polar plot of the lift coefficient versus drag for a dinghy sail. The data was obtained by Professor Marhai using wind tunnel testing of a single cloth sail similar to a laser ILCA rig. Because of the steep slope on the left side of the curve, the sail achieves a good lift-to-drag ratio when sailing close-hauled at relatively small angles of attack. Then, as we approach the top of the curve, as the apparent wind increases, we head towards a beam reach. And as we go over the top and descend on a broad reach, the angle of attack increases, a stall occurs, and the lift-to-drag ratio deteriorates. And eventually, when running, the sail produces mostly drag. The schematic on the lower left shows a laser sailing close-hauled with an apparent wind angle of 30 degrees. The total aerodynamic force, shown by the pale green arrow, acts to the center of effort and corresponds to a 30-degree point in the lift-drag curve. This is likely close to the sail's optimum close-hauled condition when sailing to windward. The light blue arrow represents the lift component acting at right angles to the apparent wind, while the yellow-orange arrow represents the drag acting parallel with the apparent wind. When sailing upwind, most of the lift force appears as sideways or heeling force. However, when resolved through the hull and centerboard, part of that force becomes the forward driving force that propels the boat. The drag force, shown in yellow-orange, is your enemy. Because it acts largely aft, it slows the boat down and reduces performance. Now, with that understanding, let's go to the next slide. Slide 5. upwind apparent wind changes and waves. In the video, the coach advised sailors to head up while climbing a wave and bear away while they descend into the trough. The next few diagrams explains why that advice is aerodynamically sound. In the upper right schematic, the boat is pitching through a range of 30 degrees about its center of gravity. Note that in all three cases, the true wind angle is 40 degrees and the true wind speed is 15 knots. Let's begin with the base case shown on the left in flat water. Here, the boat is not pitching, the true wind is 50 knots, and the boat speed is 5 knots. The resulting apparent wind speed is 19.1 knots, and the apparent wind angle is 30.3 degrees. The sail is therefore operating close to its optimum angle of attack. Now consider what happens when the boat pitches and waves. In the middle diagram, the bow is falling into a trough and is pitching downward. This rotation adds a velocity component to 9.26 knots at the sail center of effort. As a result, the apparent wind speed increases to 22.8 knots, while the apparent wind angle decreases to 24.9 degrees. Although the true wind has not changed, the sail now experiences a significantly smaller angle of attack than the optimum 30 degrees. The sail is effectively pinching, and the helmsman should bear away to restore the optimum angle of attack. Now let's look at the diagram on the right. As the bow rises toward a crest, the opposite occurs. The rotational velocity now acts away from the wind. The apparent wind speed at the center of effort decreases to 0.73 knots, while the apparent wind angle increases to 38.2 degrees. Again, the true wind has not changed, yet the sail experiences a dramatic change in apparent wind angle because the boat is rotating in pitch. Now, notice the photograph on the lower bottom of the slide. The telltales on the leeward side of this mainsail are no longer streaming smoothly, indicating flow separation and a partial stall. The boat is sailing too high and the helmsman should have borne away. This explains why sailors should bear away after crossing a crest and then head up while climbing the next wave. These helm adjustments help maintain a more constant angle of attack and keep the sail operating closer to its optimum lift-to-drag ratio. Without these corrections in both helm and sheet trim, the sail spends much of its time operating away from its optimum condition. The result is a lower average driving force and reduced progress to windward. Next slide, please. Slide 6. Wave rotary flow considerations upwind. We should now consider one final effect, the rotary flow associated with the wave itself. In episode 4, we saw that water particles within a wave travel in orbital paths. Near the surface, these orbital motions create alternating regions of favorable and unfavorable flow around the hull and foils. While the wave conditions listed here are from episode 3, we can see how grueling these conditions would be for a dinghy. As the boat approaches a crest, the local flow motion opposes its forward progress. However, after crossing the crest and entering the trough, the flow becomes favorable and assists acceleration to the next crest. This means the coaching advice serves two purposes simultaneously. First, heading up while climbing a wave helps compensate for the changing apparent wind caused by pitching up. Second, it reduces the time spent fighting the unfavorable orbital flow near the crest. Conversely, bearing away after the crest helps maintain an efficient sail angle of attack while also taking maximum advantage of a downward wave slope to gain speed to enter the favorable flow on the backside of the wave and allow the boat to accelerate into the trough. The result is improved velocity made good to windward. A sailor who masters this rhythm of heading up into the waves and bearing away after the crest is not simply steering the boat, they are synchronizing the boat's aerodynamics and hydrodynamics with the motion of the waves themselves. Now that we understand that, let's take a look at the aerodynamic forces as we round the weather mark and start our screaming reach. Next slide, please. Slide 7, optimizing sail trim on a reach. Here we see the lift and drag forces for a boat sailing on a beam reach. The apparent wind is directly over the beam, while the true wind would be coming somewhere after the beam, as shown on the upper right. Notice that we are using the same aerodynamic performance curve as before, but now the sail is operating at an angle of attack of approximately 35 degrees, which corresponds to the peak of the curve. There are several important points to note. First, the total aerodynamic force, shown by the pale green arrow, is at its maximum value at this operating point. When we resolve this force into its lift and drag components, we see that the drag components acts primarily as a heeling force. In dinghies, this can be largely offset by the crew weight, allowing the boat to remain flat and plane efficiently. More importantly, notice that the lift component, shown by the light blue arrow, is now aligned almost perfectly with the boat's direction of travel. This means that a lift force is contributing directly to forward propulsion and thus the full driving force. As a result, the beam reach is typically our fastest point of sail. The second point is that the peak of performance curve is quite narrow. Achieving maximum driving force therefore requires very accurate sail trim. If the sail is sheeted in too tightly, it moves down the left side of the curve towards a stalled condition, thereby reducing lift and driving force. If the sail is eased too far, even by only a few degrees, it moves down the right side of the curve and again produces less lift and less driving force. The challenge, whether you're sailing a laser or trimming the sails on a larger boat, is to keep the sails operating as close as possible to the peak of the curve. When sailing upwind, sailors often use leech telltales to ensure that the airflow remains attached and streams cleanly aft from both sides of the sail. However, many sail trim guides recommend that on a reach, the leech telltales should occasionally flick or curl behind the sail, perhaps 20 to 25% at a time, often without explaining why. To understand that recommendation, we need to examine what happens when a sail is trimmed for maximum lift. Let's go to the next slide. Slide 8, Beam Reach Optimizing Sail Trim, the Controlled Stall. Throughout this series, we have discussed the dangers of stalled rudders and separated flow. Yet when reaching, counterintuitively, the fastest sail trim occurs very close to the onset of a full stall on our sail plan. Looking at the photo insert, note that the airflow divides around the mast and remains attached along the windward side of the sail all the way to the leech. However, on the leeward side of the main, notice the airflow initially remains attached, but it begins to separate about halfway and remains detached along the aft portion of the sail. This condition is known as a trailing edge stall. Importantly, notice only the rear portion of the sail is stalled. The forward portion has an attached airflow and generates strong lift. This condition is associated with the maximum aerodynamic force and therefore maximum boat speed. Aircraft pilots avoid operating anywhere near this stall condition, because even a small increase in angle of attack can cause a complete loss of lift, just as we saw with rudders. However, sailors when reaching should deliberately seek this condition with their sails when reaching because, as we saw, it produces the greatest lift and lift aligns with the boat direction, giving us the largest possible driving force. The lower right diagram illustrates a method proposed by the Dutch aerodynamicist and yacht designer Hubert Sloof in The Science of Sailing. His idea, which I've never seen anywhere else, is to place telltales inside but near the leech on the leeward side of the sail to confirm stalling. Meanwhile, telltales around the 50% chord position should continue streaming aft, thereby indicating the stalled region remains confined to the aft portion of the sail and has not advanced too far forward. Although this technique is not widely used, it provides a way of trimming a sail for maximum performance on a reach. Achieving it may require adjustments to the main sheet, tension, Cunningham, and outhaul. However, I should note that on my own boat, getting the 50% chord telltales to stream aft while getting those closer to the leech to twirl, indicating a trailing edge stall, can be difficult, most likely because one is operating close to a full stall condition, and the turbulence from the mast and rig can generate a stall all along the full length of the lee side of the sail. Next slide, please. Now that we understand how to maximize speed in a reach, we can turn to the most exciting and often the most dreaded part of the race, rounding the mark at the end of our reach and bearing away on a downhill run. Let's hear what an expert from International Sailing Academy suggests on the next clip to keep yourself upright. Because when rounding the weather mark or leeward jibing mark, where speed is high, capsizes are never far away. After this video, we will break down the forces, and the viewer will be able to better understand why this advice is so applicable. Let's start the video. Slide 10, Why Dinghies Capsize to Weather. Viewers may recall this image from episode 1, where we examined why boats tend to jibe broach to windward and why dinghies often capsize to windward. As shown here, with the boat on a run and the sail east to 90 degrees, there is still a significant aerodynamic lift force, shown by the light blue arrow, acting on the sail and pointing to windward. This lift force tends to roll the boat to windward. In a dinghy, that can result in a windward capsize. In larger keel boats, as we saw in episode 1 and 2, this force can induce a violent roll to windward, potentially leading to a loss of control or a broach. From my dinghy days, this is something I experience far too often. Now, let's move to the next slide, and we'll see why this advice we were just given of letting the sail out gradually is so important to manage the capsize risk. Slide 11, Running by the Lee. In this diagram, we see the same force vectors as on the previous slide, with the sail set at 90 degrees and a substantial lift force shown in the blue tending to roll the boat to windward. However, notice what happens when the sail is trimmed in to 105 degrees and you are sailing by the lee. The total aerodynamic force, shown by the dark green arrow, increases while the lift component is greatly reduced. This explains the advice often given by the coach not to immediately ease the main sheet while bearing off in higher winds. In a laser, for example, it is usually better to gradually ease the sheet as you go onto a run to decrease the lift component gradually and while moving your body weight inboard until you are sailing by the lee and the windward lift component has been eliminated. Now, with that understanding, let's go to the next slide. Slide 12, Using wave orbital flow on a broad reach. Let's return to the wave orbital motion because these flows become even more relevant when sailing downwind on a broad reach or a run. Using our previous example on a 10-mile fetch, we see a strategy that is superficially similar to the sailing upwind, but now for very different reasons. When sailing downwind, the boat speed is much closer to the speed of the waves. A planing dinghy traveling at 10 or 12 knots will have longer periods of encounter, in the order of 20 to 30 seconds, experience either the assisting or opposing components of the wave's orbital flow. So the tactic is, as you approach a wave crest, aim for the lowest section of the crest to minimize pitching. Once over this crest, this time the orbital flow on the back of the wave will help accelerate the boat. Then, once over the crest, harden up, sheet in, and the apparent wind will move forward and you will accelerate through the trough and have your best boat speed possible through the opposing rotary flow. As you approach the next crest, again look for the low point, then bear away and ease the sheet again before crossing the next crest. I recall from my long ago dinghy days, this often required two distinct hand motions. When you approach the wave crest, you pull the tiller towards you and let out the sheet, and then once past, you push the tiller away and harden up and pull the sheet in. The sailor that most efficiently optimizes wave patterns and keeps his sail at the optimum setting will obtain the best VMG downwind. Next slide. Slide 13, Why Sail by the Lee. Now let's hear more from an expert, their suggested tactics for sailing downwind and waves, and then we'll examine the aerodynamic principles behind the recommended techniques for achieving maximum speed downwind.
Continually increase your turn as your speed drops. So you don't want to do this when you're running into the back of a wave. That's not the time to do it. It's too late to have done the drop sheet. The drop sheet's great when you're about to turn at speed. So maybe you're already on a wave, broad reach, and you're looking now to exit by the lee. This is the time now, as you've caught that wave, you can ease the sheet into the bearaway that you've just done and finish on the by the lee that you wanted. So example coming up, broad reach angle. You can tell by my wind indicator that the breeze is coming from this direction and it's going around the luff and to the leech. And then I'm about to hit this motorboat wave and wanting to come out on a by the lee angle. So just as I start that bearaway, you see the sheet going slack in my hand, dropping simultaneously, just for a moment. It's just a little one. There's a little ease there though to help assist that bearaway. And I'm waiting for the time to go all the way. There's another little one, and now ending on the angle that I wanted. See if I do it again. Little one there, little one, waiting, and bang, bearing away. Look at where the apparent wind is now, all in a second there. Broad reach angle, looking to bear away on this wave, hand nice and high, sheet out by the lee straight away. So it's just a way of helping also, I find, the sail reconnect with the leech to luff flow faster by doing that immediate drop of the sheet while bearing away. You're almost forcing the air from the leech to the luff quicker than if I was just to turn traditionally and sort of wait for that uptake. So by doing both, the bear away and the sheet drop at the same time, I'm getting a slightly quicker response, I feel, in the rig. Now there is a certain
Slide 14, how easing the sheet increases force, the drop sheet technique. Now that we understand how wave orbital motion assists us on the wave crest, we can better understand why coaches advocate the drop sheet technique. In the previous video, we saw that as the sailor approached the powerboat wake, the apparent wind moved well forward, allowing the boat to achieve maximum speed. However, as he reached the crest, he bore away and eased or dropped the main sheet significantly. This allowed the boat to accelerate down the back of the wave while sailing by the lee. By easing the sail and bearing away, the sailor generated the maximum possible driving force, as shown by the dark green arrow, while minimizing any side force and thereby reducing or eliminating any tendency to capsize. If the wind and wave conditions permit, dinghy sailors can maximize their VMG on a run by not sailing in a straight line. Instead, for lasers ILCAs, the optimum technique is to sail a series of broad-reaching angles at high speed in the troughs, then perform a drop sheet maneuver on the crests and sail by the lee to maximize acceleration. This is essentially the same principle used by larger boats sailing with asymmetrical spinnakers when racing downwind. They run downwind in a zigzag pattern. Next, let's examine the aerodynamic forces and the difference between a dinghy sailing on a dead run in flat water and then climbing a wave crest and then descending on a wave front. Next slide, please. Slide 15, how wave motion changes apparent wind and sail force downwind. Now that we understand how easing the main sheet and sailing by the lee can increase the sail force while climbing a wave back and then starting to accelerate down a wave face, let's compare the sail forces experienced in both flat water and those in waves. In the upper left, in the flat water, the laser is running at 15 knots of true wind at 5 knots of boat speed. That produces an apparent wind speed of 10 knots. The graph below from episode 1 shows the relationship between wind speed and wind pressure. For simplicity, we'll treat the knots and miles per hour as equal. Starting at the 10-mile-an-hour apparent wind speed on the horizontal axis and following the blue arrow to the curve and then over to the vertical axis gives us a wind pressure of approximately 0.5 pounds per square foot. Multiplying this pressure by the full laser sail area of approximately 76 square feet gives us a total aerodynamic force of about 38 pounds acting on the sail. Now let's examine what happens in waves. A 15-knot wind blowing over a fetch of roughly 10 miles can produce relatively steep waves of approximately 2 to 4 feet high. As the dinghy climbs the back of the wave, two things occur simultaneously. First, the boat naturally slows, perhaps from about 5 knots to around 3 knots. Second, because the hull and rig rotate backwards while climbing the wave, the sail also rotates towards the wind. In this example, these two effects combine to increase the apparent wind from approximately 10 knots to about 12 knots. Now return to the graph and follow the green arrow at 12 miles an hour. Notice that because the wind pressure increases with the square of the wind speed, as we saw in episode 1, this modest increase in apparent wind produces a slightly disproportionately larger increase in aerodynamic force. This additional sail force helps the dinghy continue climbing the wave and rotate over the crest. Then, once over the crest, gravity accelerates the boat down the wave face. Boat speed may increase to about 7 knots, while the rig rotates forward with the hull. The increased boat speed now reduces the apparent wind to approximately 8 knots, as shown by the red arrow on the graph. This produces a noticeable reduction in sail force compared with the climb up the wave back. The important point here is that as the boat pitches over successive waves, the apparent wind, and therefore the aerodynamic force in the sail, is continuously increasing and decreasing. These changing forces create an opportunity for the sailor to change technique. Rather than simply continuing dead downwind, the speed gained while surfing can be used to harden up onto a broad reach, while the stronger and more forward apparent wind can be exploited much more effectively. Now, let's examine how that works on the next slide. Slide 16. Why we can hold extra boat speed on a broad reach. In this schematic, we examine the wind forces that explain why hardening up after gaining speed from surfing down a wave can be so beneficial. When the boat is on a wave crest, it has stored potential energy. and by the action of accelerating down the wave face, we convert that into kinetic energy in the form of increased boat speed. The challenge then is to maintain the increased boat speed as long as possible. Once the boat accelerates down the face of a wave, then hardens up in the trough, two important effects occur. First, the increase in boat speed creates a stronger apparent wind. As the apparent wind increases and moves forward, the sail generates greater aerodynamic force. Second, as shown in the diagram on the left, the sail is now producing both lift and drag. The combined aerodynamic force, as shown by the light green arrow, becomes more closely aligned with the boat's direction of travel. We saw before on a beam reach, the lift force aligned directly with the direction of travel and therefore became the driving force. In this case, even though the apparent wind on a broad reach will be less than on a beam reach, now the total aerodynamic force, as shown by the light green arrow, will be close to the boat's direction of travel, and therefore maximizes the driving force forward. As a result, a greater proportion of the sail force contributes directly to propulsion. Also, notice the dotted orange line, which represents the boat's heading relative to the apparent wind. Although the boat is hardened up, it is only sailing about 25 to 30 degrees away from the dead downwind course. In summary, the key advantage of heading up is the apparent wind becomes both stronger and more forward. When this happens, although the drag component is slightly reduced, the sail is now able to generate substantially more lift. The combination of the stronger apparent wind and the increased lift in combination with the addition of the drag force produces a larger total aerodynamic force that converts into higher boat speed. This is why high-performance dinghies and racing keelboats often achieve their best downwind VMG not by sailing directly at the mark, but by sailing a series of broad-reaching angles that maximize apparent wind and aerodynamic efficiency. We have now seen that a laser sailor can partially emulate the tactics used by boats carrying asymmetric spinnakers. By sailing down the lee, easing the sheet on wave crests, and accelerating down the wave face, and then hardening up through the trough, the sailor can exploit the increased apparent wind and achieve significantly higher downwind speeds. On the next slide, we'll compare this practical technique to the theoretical performance limits of a laser polar diagram. Next slide. Slide 17, comparison of the laser polar diagram. There's a lot of information on this slide, so let's break it down step by step. On the right is a polar performance diagram. Polar diagrams are commonly used to predict a boat's speed at different sailing angles relative to the true wind. The concentric circles represent the boat speed, while the colored curves show the predicted performance of a laser, ILCA, in various wind strengths. The data originates from research conducted in Australia during the development of a laser sailing simulator. My understanding is that the original simulator used a theoretical green polar curve. However, subsequent on-water testing revealed that the actual boat performance differed with the theoretical predictions, resulting in the blue curve shown here. Before examining the downwind performance, let's briefly review the concept of hull speed on the upper left. The theoretical hull speed of a displacement hull is given by the hull speed equals to 1.34 times the square root of the waterline length. For a laser with a waterline length of approximately 12.5 feet, the theoretical hull speed is about 4.7 knots, or very close to 5 knots. Traditional displacement boats are largely constrained by this limit because wave-making resistance increases dramatically as hull speed is approached. Dinghies, however, are typically only governed by the hull speed formula when sailing upwind and on a run. Lasers, ILCAs, and other dinghies on reaches, because of the alignment of the large lift force with the boat's direction of travel, can attain speeds that allow them to climb over their bow wave on a plane and exceed the theoretical hull speed limitation. I couldn't find a full measured drag curve of a laser ILCA, but after several frustrating attempts with ChatGPT, I managed to produce this one, which I believe is fairly accurate. Note that the resistance rises steeply as hull speed is approached, and the dotted blue line shows approximately the resistance trend that a non-planing 12.5 long displacement hull would experience. Note that the resistance caused by the wave making rises exponentially. However, older planing dinghies are different, and when the sail plan provides sufficient energy and gives the boat sufficient speed, it can pass the hump in the curve. And once the hull has climbed up on its own bow wave and begins planing, resistance continues to increase, but at a much lower rate than would be experienced for a displacement hull. Now with that understanding, let's return to the polar diagram. At position 1, it represents 12 knots of true wind and a dead downwind course. The predicted boat speed is a little less than under 5 knots. This corresponds closely with the theoretical hull speed we just calculated. Without the ability to plane, that would likely represent the practical speed limit. However, the measured on-water blue curve tells a different story. In real-world sailing conditions, 12 knots of wind usually produces some wave action. We saw that by sailing by the lee, easing the sheet on wave crests, and accelerating down the wave face, sailors can exceed hull speed by surfing. The measured data suggests speeds reaching 7 knots near position 2 while sailing almost directly downwind. Even more interesting, as the sailor hardens up under a broad reach near position 3 and exploits the increased apparent wind, speeds approaching 8 knots in a 12-knot true wind speed condition should become achievable. Provides evidence that techniques discussed throughout this episode are not simply theoretical. They are reflected in measured on-water performance and explains why skilled laser sailors often sail significantly faster than the traditional displacement hull theory would predict. And with that, let's go to the final slide and video. Slide 18, putting this into practice. With what we have learned, let's watch a sailor who applies these techniques exceptionally well. In the following video, a young Danish sailor repeatedly eases the sheet on wave crests, accelerates down the wave faces, hardens up in the troughs, and uses the resulting apparent wind increase to maintain a race-winning lead. She's a joy to watch, and Dan Seltz's commentary is spot on. Let's watch it.
Again, you're nothing. All right, so we're back on their second downwind now, and we are going to be following Anne-Marie a bit, who is still in the lead here. And now we get a really good shot because you can see exactly the waves behind her. And so you can see that these waves, they're not standing up so much, so you can't really surf them for that long. And especially in the radial or the ILCA 6, you don't really have enough power to surf for as long as you can in the ILCA 7. So at the moment, these girls are probably sailing in 15 to 18 knots by the looks of it, maybe a little more. And they're not fully surfing, they're more surging really. And they're waiting for a good wave. Then you surge down the face of it and try to turn that into VMG downwind. Interesting thing to note here as well with Anne-Marie's setup is that she is using quite a lot of Vang in these conditions. So you'll see that when she drops the main sheet, her leech really isn't flicking that much. And I think she's done that basically because when you're sailing in these swell conditions, you're going to be turning a lot and you're also going to be doing very large upturns. So you'll often be going at a very broad reach, and having that vane tighter is just going to help you get the most speed out of the boat when you are on those higher angles.
Yeah.
The other really crucial point that I noticed from this video is that these top sailors kind of have two modes in these conditions when they're sailing downwind. They have a mode where they're kind of in down pressure or there's no good waves around, and they're basically just trying to stay subtle, maximize VMG using any surges they can. And then they have this second mode where they might have some really big catchable swell behind them, or they're in a gust, and they're basically just sailing massive angles, trying to surf for as long as possible, and really trying to go for maximum boat speed rather than maximum VMG. And you'll see them switching between those two modes quite a lot here.
That's all.
So you'll see Emery stayed by the lee for a long time here. I think she's basically just waiting for an opportunity to be able to surf a good wave, because at the moment it's looking like you can't catch every wave basically. And in these conditions, if you try to catch every single wave, you're going to end up sailing way too much distance.
This brings us to the end of the 7-part series on heavy weather sailing. I created this series because I felt the mechanics of heavy weather were difficult to find in practical form. My goal was to provide a deeper understanding of what is happening when sailors meet challenging conditions. The knowledge you have been exposed to over these 7 episodes will not necessarily make heavy weather any more comfortable. However, it may help you avoid dangerous situations and, when caught in severe conditions, better understand what is happening around you, and perhaps less stressful or fearful when the weather becomes dire. Now, beside me are 2 stacks of books. One stack contains technical references, many written by Marhai, who explain the science of sailing. The other stack contains books on sail trim and boat handling. What struck me is these 2 bodies of knowledge are largely separate. Technical books explain the forces involved, but provide little guidance on practical application. On the other hand, sail trim books, articles, and videos provide plenty of advice on what adjustments to make, but offer little explanation why these adjustments work. Several subscribers asked if I would produce a material on sailing faster. Over the years, I've given talks on how sailors can use knowledge of how sails work to improve boat speed. To give you a glimpse of what that might look like, I expanded the preceding section on laser sailing with Professor Marhai's technical work, information from the web, and the excellent coaching videos. If there is sufficient interest, I may return in the fall with a new series, and you can see it here, the outline of it. Maximize sail power by understanding how sails work, the forces they generate, and interpreting your telltales. I've included a link below of a presentation that I've given to junior sailors in high school and who mostly understood this material, so feel free to check it out. Before I close, I would like to ask for your help. I've been reluctant to ask viewers to like, subscribe, and ring the bell with each of my videos. However, I know how annoying it is, but I now understand why those YouTubers do this, because without these actions, the algorithm drops the channel, and as a result, this content, which I think you know is not available anywhere else in this forum, is not recommended to other sailors. So if you would like to see more content on the engineering behind sailing, I would greatly appreciate your support. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. Otherwise, you probably won't be informed if I do bring out a new series. Most importantly, please leave a comment below and let me know whether a sail trim series is something you'd like to see. Producing these videos requires an investment of my time, money, and effort, and your feedback will help determine whether I undertake that project. So thank you to everyone who stayed with me through all these episodes, and until next time possibly, sail safe.